My name is Marcus Thorne. I am 58 years old, and for 30 of those years, I was a deputy with the Shannon County Sheriff's Department down here in Missouri. When I retired, I thought I'd seen the worst that people could do to each other and the worst that nature could throw at you. I'd worked floods, tornadoes, manhunts in the deep woods of the Ozarks, and pulled more than my share of bodies out of wrecked cars and remote cabins. I thought I was grounded. I thought I knew the shape of the world. I was wrong. What I do now, or what I did until a few years ago, was wildlife photography. It was my way of staying connected to the woods I grew up in, but on my own terms, without the yellow tape and the flashing lights. It was supposed to be peaceful. This happened 4 years ago, in late October. The leaves were at their peak, a riot of orange and crimson clinging to the hills. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. My best friend, Cal Robertson, had called me up. His family owned an old, dilapidated hunting cabin deep in a section of the Mark Twain National Forest that was barely touched by public access roads. He wanted to go for a long weekend, get away from everything. He was bringing his nephew, Brian, and Brian's new girlfriend, Megan. I'd known Cal since we were kids. We'd learned to hunt and fish in these same woods. He was ex-Marine, steady as a rock. Brian was in his mid-20s, full of the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been truly tested. Megan was a city girl from St. Louis, and you could tell the deep woods made her nervous. The plan was simple: drive out to the end of a county maintenance road, unlock a private gate, and then take Cal's heavy-duty four-wheel drive truck down another 3 miles of what was less a road and more a suggestion of one, a rutted track of mud and rock that snaked through the dense oak and hickory. The cabin itself was nothing more than a single room built from thick, hand-hewn logs sometime in the 1940s. It had a stone fireplace, a few rickety bunks, and a heavy plank door. The windows were just square holes in the logs, covered with hinged wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. No electricity, no running water. Just a well with a hand pump out back, and a world of trees pressing in on all sides. For me, it was perfect. We arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The truck groaned and protested the whole way in, branches scraping along the sides like fingernails. When we finally pulled into the small, overgrown clearing where the cabin stood, the silence was the first thing that hit you. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air. Megan got out of the truck and just stood there, looking around with wide eyes. "It's so quiet," she said, her voice a small thing in the vastness.
Brian laughed and slung an arm around her. "That's the point, Meg. No sirens, no neighbors, just us and the squirrels." Cal just grunted, already pulling gear from the truck bed. He shot me a look, a small, knowing smile. He knew I lived for this kind of quiet. We spent the last hour of daylight getting settled. I helped Cal unbar the shutters to let in the fading light, while Brian gathered firewood. Megan tried to help, but she was jumpy, startling at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. Cal was patient with her, showing her how to stack the wood and work the old well pump. I set up my camera gear on the sturdy wooden table inside, cleaning my lenses, checking my batteries. The goal for the weekend, for me at least, was to hike to a place called Hemlock Falls, a series of cascades that would be flowing heavy after the week's rain. I wanted to capture it in the soft light of dawn. As dusk settled, a deep purple and bruised orange bleeding through the trees, we got a fire going in the stone pit out front. The flames pushed back the encroaching darkness, creating a small, warm bubble of civilization in the middle of nowhere. Brian broke out a couple of beers, and Cal started grilling sausages on a grate over the fire. The smell was incredible, mixing with the scent of burning oak. For a little while, everything was perfect. Brian told a few bad jokes, Megan slowly started to relax, and Cal and I talked about old times, about hunts we'd been on in this very area. The sounds of the forest came alive around us, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl,
the rustle of some small creature in the underbrush. It was the normal, comforting symphony of the woods at night. Then it stopped. It wasn't a gradual thing. It was like someone flipped a switch. 1 second, the air was filled with the thrum of 1,000 tiny lives.
The next, there was absolute, profound silence. Not the peaceful quiet from earlier, but a dead, waiting silence. The crickets were gone. The owl was gone. Even the breeze in the treetops seemed to have died. All we could hear was the crackle of our own fire. I froze, a half-eaten sausage in my hand. I looked at Cal. He was frozen too, his head cocked, listening. His eyes met mine across the fire, and I saw the same question in them. "What was that?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She was looking out into the impenetrable blackness beyond the firelight. Brian, ever the joker, tried to lighten the mood. Probably a deer or something spooked them all. But his voice lacked its usual easy confidence. He was looking out into the dark, too. The silence held for a long minute. It felt unnatural, like holding your breath. You could feel the pressure of it. I've spent thousands of nights in the woods. I know the sounds. I also know when they're wrong. And this was wrong.
Then came the other sound. It started faint, from a long way off, down in the hollow to the west of the cabin. It was a heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of something walking. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across the forest floor. Something dead weight. The thumps were punctuated by the sharp crack of branches breaking, the scrape of rock. It was moving slowly, but steadily, getting closer. I tried to place it. A hunter dragging a deer? Not at this time of night, not this deep in. A bear? Maybe. A big one, dragging a kill. That was the most logical explanation. But the sound had a weight, a deliberation to it, that didn't feel like an animal. The dragging sound continued for another minute, seeming to pass by our position a few hundred yards out in the darkness before it stopped. The dead silence rushed back in to fill the void. We all sat there, nobody moving, barely breathing. Then a new sound split the night. A sharp, wet crack. It wasn't wood. It was louder, deeper. It sounded exactly like a thick, green bone being snapped over a knee. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I'd heard that sound before, on car accidents. It was the sound of a femur breaking. "Okay, what the hell was that?" Brian said, his voice low. The humor was completely gone now. He stood up and peered into the darkness, as if he could somehow see what was making the noise. Cal put a hand on his arm. "Sit down, Brian." His voice was calm, but it had an edge of command that I hadn't heard in years. It was his Marine voice. Brian sat. Megan had pulled her knees up to her chest, her face pale in the firelight. "Bear," Cal said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than us. "Big one. Probably took down a buck and is settling in for a meal." I nodded, wanting to believe it. "Has to be," I added. "Nothing else out here is big enough to make that much noise." But my own words felt hollow. I've been around bears. I've seen what they do to a kill. They tear and rip, but the sound of a deliberate, single snap of a large bone, that wasn't right. It felt too clean, too purposeful. We stayed by the fire for another hour, but the mood was ruined. The silence persisted. Not a single cricket started back up. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Every snap of the fire made us jump. Eventually, the cold started to bite, and Cal made the call. All right, let's get inside. Bar the door. We doused the fire, plunging our little clearing into near total darkness, relieved only by a sliver of moon. The walk from the fire pit to the cabin door, a distance of maybe 20 feet, felt like a mile. I kept my eyes scanning the tree line, my hand resting on the holstered pistol I wore on my belt, a habit from my years on the force that I'd never broken. Inside, Cal slid the heavy iron bolt across the door. The sound of it locking into place was deeply reassuring.
He then went to each of the 4 windows, making sure the thick wooden shutters were barred tight. The cabin was plunged into absolute blackness. The next morning, the world seemed normal again. Sunlight streamed in through the cracks in the logs. When I unbarred the door and stepped outside, the air was cool and clean, and the birds were singing. The oppressive silence of the night before was gone, a bad dream. Brian was already up, trying to act like he hadn't been scared. "See, just a bear," he said with a forced swagger. "Probably miles away by now." Megan looked relieved, and even Cal seemed to have shaken off the unease. I wasn't so sure. I walked the perimeter of the clearing. I didn't see any tracks, but the ground was covered in a thick mat of damp leaves, making it hard to tell. Still, the feeling of wrongness from the night before lingered at the back of my mind. After a quick breakfast of coffee and oatmeal, we decided to stick to the plan and hike to Hemlock Falls. I grabbed my camera bag. Cal grabbed his rifle, a bolt-action .30-06 he always brought to the cabin, and we set off. Brian and Megan followed behind. The trail was faint, little more than a game trail that wound its way down into the hollow where we'd heard the sounds. The woods were beautiful. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, painting the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold. For a while, I almost forgot about the night before. I was in my element, pointing out different types of trees to Megan, identifying bird calls for Brian. About a mile in, we found it. The smell hit us first. The coppery, gut-wrenching stench of blood and viscera. It was heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. We rounded a bend in the trail, and there it was, a white-tailed buck, or what was left of it. It was laid out right in the middle of the trail, almost deliberately placed. I stopped dead. Cal came up beside me and let out a low whistle. Brian and Megan stopped behind us, Megan gasping and turning her head away. I've seen hundreds of animal kills in my life. I've seen what cougars do, what bears do, what coyotes do. This was none of those. The buck's neck was broken, its head twisted at an impossible angle. But that wasn't the worst part. The chest cavity had been ripped open with enormous force. The rib cage wasn't crushed, it was splayed open. The ribs snapped cleanly at the spine, like someone had pried it apart with a crowbar. The organs were mostly gone, but what was left was strewn about in a way that seemed almost decorative. The spine itself was snapped in half, the 2 halves of the deer pulled apart. This was the source of the sound we'd heard, the sharp, wet crack. "No bear did this," I said, my voice flat. Cal was circling the carcass, his face grim, the rifle held loosely in his hands. "No bear I've ever seen," he agreed. "Look at the tracks." I knelt down. The ground around the kill was churned up, but in one patch of softer mud, there was a partial print. It was huge, easily twice the size of my boot. It was canine in shape, like a wolf's, but there was something wrong with it. The proportions were off. The heel pad was too long, too humanoid, and there were 5 toes, not 4. "What in God's name?" I whispered. Brian, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "Maybe it was a pack of wolves? Or coyotes?" "Wolves aren't in this part of Missouri," Cal said, not taking his eyes off the tree line. "And coyotes don't do this. This is rage. This isn't feeding. This is a message." He was right. It felt staged,
The placement on the trail, the horrific display of strength. It was like something was marking its territory, telling us we weren't welcome. We didn't stay long. The smell was making Megan gag, and the sight of it was turning my own stomach. We continued on to the falls, but the joy was gone from the hike. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a growl. I took my pictures at the falls, but my heart wasn't in it. I was just going through the motions, my mind replaying the image of that brutalized carcass. We got back to the cabin in the mid-afternoon. The mood was somber. Nobody talked much. Brian wasn't making jokes anymore. He stayed close to the cabin, helping Cal chop more wood than we could possibly need for one night. It was busy work, a way to deal with the fear that was now a palpable thing between all of us. I sat on the porch, cleaning my pistol, the simple mechanical task a small comfort. I kept my eyes on the woods, scanning the trees, looking for any movement, any shape that was out of place. As evening approached, the temperature dropped. A thick, damp fog began to roll up from the hollow, swallowing the trees and muffling all sound. The world shrank until it was just our little cabin and the 20 or 30 feet of clearing we could see before the gray wall of mist. The idea of another campfire was unanimously rejected. We retreated inside long before sunset, barring the door and shutters again, sealing ourselves into our little wooden box. Cal lit a couple of kerosene lanterns, which cast a warm, flickering glow around the single room. We ate a cold dinner of sandwiches and chips, nobody having the appetite for much else. Megan was huddled in one of the bunks, wrapped in a blanket, her face a mask of anxiety. Brian sat at the table, staring at the wood grain, his jaw tight. Cal and I sat near the fireplace, where a small fire fought back the damp chill. We didn't speak of what we saw, but it was all we were thinking about. The night started quietly. The fog outside deadened all sound, creating an even more profound silence than the night before. Hours passed. I found myself dozing in my chair, the warmth of the fire making me drowsy despite the tension. I was drifting in that space between wakefulness and sleep when a sound brought me instantly fully awake. It was a soft, scraping noise. It came from the west wall of the cabin, the one facing the deep woods. Scrape, scrape. It was the sound of something sharp, like a claw, being dragged slowly across the log walls. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at Cal. He was already awake, his eyes wide, the rifle resting across his lap. He put a finger to his lips. Brian and Megan were asleep, or pretending to be. The scraping stopped. We waited, listening. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of my own breathing. Then came a new sound, closer this time. A low, wet sniffing right at the base of the heavy plank door. Sniff, sniff. A deep, guttural inhale, like a huge animal trying to catch our scent from under the door. I could feel the vibration of it through the floorboards. A low growl followed the sniffing. It wasn't like a dog's growl or a bear's. It was deeper, a resonant rumble that seemed to come from a massive chest cavity. It was a sound of pure menace, of territorial dominance. It vibrated through the very logs of the cabin. Megan let out a small, terrified whimper from her bunk. The growling stopped instantly. The thing outside had heard her. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then, a heavy thump against the door, as if something had just leaned its full weight against it. The thick wood groaned under the pressure. I drew my pistol from its holster, the metallic click of the safety being disengaged, sounding deafeningly loud in the small room. Cal raised his rifle, pointing it towards the door. We were in a siege.
Something was outside and it was testing our defenses. The pressure on the door eased. We heard heavy footsteps on the wooden porch. Thump, thump, thump.
It was walking on two legs. The steps were too slow, too heavy, too evenly spaced for a four-legged animal. It walked the length of the porch and stopped beneath the front window. Then, the most terrifying thing yet, we heard a faint metallic rattle. It was the iron handle on the outside of the shutter. It jiggled. Once. Twice. Then it began to turn, slowly, deliberately. This wasn't a dumb beast. A bear doesn't turn a handle. A cougar doesn't test a lock. This thing was smart. It was problem-solving. It was trying to figure out how to get inside. Cal moved silently from his chair and stood beside the window, his rifle aimed at the thick wood of the shutter. The handle stopped turning. There was a long pause, then a soft, inquisitive tap, tap, tap on the shutter, almost like a person knocking. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This was beyond anything I could comprehend. The psychological element of it was the worst part. The scraping, the sniffing, the testing of the handle, the polite little knock. It was a nightmare. I crept over to the back window, the one that looked out towards the well and the tool shed. There was a small knothole in the shutter, no bigger than my thumb. My heart pounding, I put my eye to it and peered out. At first, all I could see was the swirling gray fog and the faint silhouette of the trees. Then, something moved. A shape detached itself from the darkness of the tree line and stepped into the dim, misty moonlight of the clearing. It was huge, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was standing on 2 legs, but they were bent wrong, like a dog's, with the hocks halfway up the leg. Its shoulders were immense, a solid wall of muscle, and its arms were too long for its body, hanging down almost to its knees. It was covered in thick, dark fur that looked matted and filthy. It turned its head, and I felt the breath catch in my throat. I couldn't see the details clearly through the fog and the small hole, but the shape was unmistakable. It was the head of a wolf or a giant dog with a long snout and pointed ears, a silhouette of pure, primal terror. It took a step, and its gait was a strange, loping shuffle, a horrifying blend of man and beast. It was the thing from my partial glimpse the night before, but now it was here, right here, circling us. I backed away from the window, my mind reeling. I looked at Cal, and he must have seen the horror on my face. "What is it?" he mouthed silently. I just shook my head, unable to form the words. I didn't have to. At that moment, a rock, the size of a bowling ball, slammed into the side of the cabin with incredible force. The impact was like a car crash. The entire structure shook, dust raining down from the rafters. A jar of spices rattled off a shelf and shattered on the floor. Megan screamed, a raw, piercing shriek of pure terror. That scream seemed to break the spell. The thing outside answered with a roar. It was a sound that defied description, a hellish symphony of a wolf's howl, a bear's guttural bellow, and the shriek of tearing metal. It was a sound of absolute rage, and it was right outside our wall. Brian, who had been frozen in fear, finally snapped. He grabbed a high-powered flashlight from his pack, scrambled to the front window, fumbled with the bar, and threw the shutter open. "Brian, no!" Cal yelled, but it was too late. A brilliant white beam cut through the darkness and the fog, and it landed squarely on the creature. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 yards away, caught in the act of stooping for another rock. The light froze it in place, and for 3, maybe 4 seconds, we saw it perfectly. The details burned themselves into my brain.
The head was that of a monstrous canine, a timber wolf or a giant shepherd with a long, wet snout and lips pulled back in a permanent snarl, revealing yellowed fangs as long as my fingers. Its fur was a mangy, dark brown, caked with mud and something that looked like dried blood. The eyes. I will never forget the eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They glowed with a faint, sickly yellow-green light of their own, and they were filled with a terrifying, hateful intelligence. It was standing on those backward bent, digitigrade legs, and its arms, long and sinewy, ended in hands, not paws. They were horribly, unnaturally human-like hands, but oversized and tipped with thick black claws like a bear's. It was a thing of impossible anatomy, a walking contradiction that should not exist. The creature shielded its eyes from the light with one of its long arms, and the roar it let out this time was one of pure, unrestrained fury. It dropped the rock and charged, not at the open window, but at the cabin itself. It moved with a speed that was terrifying, covering the 30 yards in just a few bounds, a blur of dark fur and murderous intent. It didn't try the door. It slammed its entire body weight, a solid wall of muscle and bone, into the front wall of the cabin, right next to the door frame. The impact was like being hit by a truck. The logs groaned, and the whole cabin felt like it shifted on its foundation. I was thrown off my feet, crashing into the table. It hit the wall again, and again. A percussive, deafening rhythm of pure violence. Boom, boom, boom. Dust and splinters filled the air. It was trying to break the cabin apart through sheer brute force. Then it stopped. We heard it scrambling, claws finding purchase on the logs. It was trying to tear the shutters off the windows. The sound of splintering wood filled the room as its claws, thick as railroad spikes, gouged deep into the planks, ripping and tearing at them. Cal fired his rifle through the shutter it was attacking. The blast was deafening inside the small room. The bullet tore through the wood, followed by a high-pitched yelp of pain and rage from outside. The tearing stopped. For a moment, we thought he'd driven it off. Then we heard a new sound, one that was somehow even more terrifying. The screech of tortured metal. I scrambled back to my peephole at the rear window. The creature had abandoned the cabin and was now attacking our truck. It was hunched over the front driver's side wheel. With a sickening, explosive pop, it ripped the tire from the rim. It tossed the shredded rubber aside like it was nothing. It moved to the back tire. Pop. Then it stood up, grabbed the top of the driver's side door, and began to pull. The metal of the truck door groaned, whined, and then tore with a horrific shriek as the creature bent it backwards, folding it in half. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a mindless beast lashing out. It was strategic. It was methodical. It had identified our only means of escape and was systematically destroying it. It was ensuring we were trapped here. With it. The intelligence, the cold, calculated malice of it, was more horrifying than the physical strength. It was hunting us. After it had ruined the truck to its satisfaction, it turned its attention back to the cabin. But it didn't charge the walls again. We heard its claws scraping on the porch posts. Then a heavy weight landed on the porch roof above us. Thump, thump, thump. It was walking on the roof, testing for a weak spot. It stopped over the stone chimney. We heard it sniffing, then the sound of its claws scraping against the stone, trying to get a grip, trying to find a way down. This was the moment Brian broke. The combination of seeing the creature, the violence of the attack on the cabin, the destruction of the truck, and now the sound of it directly overhead,
It was too much. His survival instinct, twisted by pure terror, gave him the worst possible idea. "I'm not dying in here," he screamed, his voice cracking. He scrambled for the front door. "Brian, don't!" Cal and I both yelled at once, but he wasn't listening. He threw the heavy bolt back. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence. He yanked the door open and sprinted out into the foggy darkness, a desperate, suicidal dash for the woods. The creature on the roof reacted instantly. It had been focused on the chimney, but the sound of the door and Brian's frantic footsteps were a new stimulus. We heard it drop from the roof, a heavy, bone-jarring thud as it landed on the soft earth of the clearing. It was impossibly fast. Brian had maybe a 10-foot head start. It wasn't enough. The creature intercepted him before he even reached the tree line. We saw its massive, dark form slam into him, a collision of terrible force. Brian screamed, a short, choked-off sound that was cut off with a wet crunch. "Brian!" Cal bellowed, a sound of pure anguish and fury. He was already in the open doorway, the rifle at his shoulder. The creature had Brian on the ground. It had one of its huge, clawed hands on his chest, and it was leaning over him. Cal fired. The .30-06 roared, and the bullet struck the creature high in its left shoulder. It staggered back, howling in pain, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the night. It dropped Brian's limp body. For a split second, its attention was off its prey and on the source of its pain. It turned, its glowing yellow eyes locking onto Cal standing in the doorway. It snarled, blood dripping from its fangs and from the new wound in its shoulder, and it lunged for him. Everything happened in a blur of panicked motion. As the creature charged Cal, I grabbed Megan, who was frozen in a silent scream, and shoved her towards the back of the cabin.
There was a small secondary door there, a flimsy thing that led out towards the well. "Go, run to the creek and follow it downstream. Don't stop," I yelled, pushing her out into the night. I turned back to the main room just in time to see the creature collide with Cal. It was a whirlwind of claws and teeth. Cal got one more shot off, but the aim was wild as the thing fell upon him. He went down with a grunt of pain. I knew they were gone. Both of them. There was no helping them. It was about survival now, raw and ugly. I raised my pistol and fired, aiming for the creature's thick torso as it savaged my friend. Pop, pop, pop. I emptied half the magazine into its side and back. The bullet seemed to have little effect beyond enraging it further. It whipped its head around, its horrifying face now focused on me. It let out another of those ground-shaking roars and started to push itself off Cal's body, turning its full, murderous attention in my direction. I didn't wait.
I slammed the flimsy back door shut, fumbling with a simple slide bolt. I heard its immense weight hit the front of the cabin again as it came for me. I grabbed Megan's arm. She was stumbling, paralyzed with shock. I half-dragged her into the woods. "Run!" I screamed, pulling her along. We crashed through the underbrush, thorns and branches tearing at our clothes and skin. Behind us, I heard the back door of the cabin splinter into pieces, followed by a roar of frustration as the creature found us gone. Then came the sounds of pursuit, the heavy, bipedal crashing through the woods behind us. It was faster than us, stronger, and it was on its home turf. The only thing we had was a head start and sheer animal panic. We ran blindly, without a light, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the fog and the downward slope of the land. I knew the creek was at the bottom of the hollow. Water, I thought. Follow the water. It's the surest way out of these hills. We fell. We got up. We kept running. My lungs burned. My legs were lead. But the sound of that thing crashing through the woods behind us
was a relentless motivator. At one point, I glanced back and saw it, a hulking shadow moving between the trees, gaining on us. We finally burst through a thicket of rhododendron and tumbled into the icy water of the creek. It was only knee-deep, but the shock of the cold was galvanizing. I pulled Megan to her feet. "This way, downstream." We splashed and stumbled through the rocky creek bed, the water hiding our scent and muffling our footsteps. The sounds of pursuit seemed to fall back, confused. The creature was fast, but maybe it was less willing to enter the water. We didn't stop to find out. We stayed in that creek for what felt like an eternity, long after the sounds behind us had faded. Every shadow on the bank was the creature. Every snapping twig was its approach. Hours passed.
The fog began to thin as the sky in the east turned from black to a bruised purple. We finally staggered out of the creek when we hit a place where the banks were too steep to navigate. We were soaked, freezing, and bleeding from a dozen cuts. Megan was in a state of shock, not speaking, just letting me lead her. We found a faint trail, which eventually widened into a gravel road. A fire road. I had never been so happy to see a road in my life. We followed it, walking like zombies, as the sun finally rose. It was maybe an hour later when we heard the rumble of an engine. A beat-up green pickup truck came around a bend. A hunter on his way to a deer stand. He stopped, his eyes wide at the sight of us. I flagged him down, and I think I collapsed right there on the gravel. The hunter drove us into the nearest town with a sheriff's station. I knew the sheriff, a man named Henderson. I'd worked with him for years. I tried to tell him the story, my voice hoarse, my mind a jumble of exhaustion and horror. I told him about the silence, the deer, the sounds, the attack. I told him what I saw. I described the creature in detail. He listened patiently, his face a mask of professional concern. He looked at my condition, at Megan, who was now wrapped in a blanket in the corner of his office, rocking back and forth silently. He got our statements. He said all the right things. He told me he'd send a team of deputies and the State Highway Patrol and the conservation agents out to the cabin immediately. I was taken to a local clinic, treated for exposure and lacerations, and given a sedative. I slept for 18 hours. When I woke up, Sheriff Henderson was there. His face was grim. He told me they had found the site. The cabin was heavily damaged. The truck was destroyed just as I'd described. They found Cal's rifle and the spent casings from my pistol. And they found Cal and Brian, or what was left of them. His official report, he told me, would state that my friends were attacked and killed by an unusually large and aggressive black bear. The damage to the cabin and truck was, in his official opinion, consistent with a bear attack. "A bear?" I asked, my voice incredulous. "Jim, you know as well as I do a bear didn't do that. A bear doesn't bend a steel truck door in half. A bear doesn't turn a handle." He just looked at me with tired eyes. "Mark, what else could it be? What do you want me to write in my report? That you were attacked by a monster? They'd have my badge, and they'd put you in a padded room." He told me they found bear tracks, big ones. They even found some dark fur snagged on the truck's broken mirror. Bear fur, the lab would surely confirm. It was a neat, tidy explanation. It closed the case. It buried the truth under a pile of paperwork. I was helpless. I was a retired deputy, a crazy old man telling ghost stories. Who would believe me against the official report?
The investigation was closed. A tragic animal attack. The local paper ran a small story. A warning was issued for hikers in that part of the forest for a few weeks, and then it was all forgotten. A few days after I was released from the clinic, one of the older deputies, a guy named Roy I'd known forever, came to my house. He sat at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "I believe you, Mark." He told me that his grandfather, who had been a logger in those woods back in the 30s, used to talk about them. He called them dog heads, said they were bad medicine, said you'd hear them on quiet nights, and if you did, you packed up and left and never came back. Roy told me about a half-dozen unsolved disappearances and strange reports from that specific region over the last 50 years.
All of them filed away, unexplained.
Some things are best left alone, he said, finishing his coffee. The department knows it. The conservation guys know it. We don't talk about it. It's better for everyone that way. He was warning me, stay quiet, let it go. I couldn't let it go. It lives with me. Megan never recovered. Her family had her committed to a private facility. They say she suffers from severe PTSD. She never spoke another coherent word about that night. She just screams sometimes. I have my own nightmares. I see those glowing yellow eyes, the impossible body, the human-like hands with their filthy claws. I hear that roar. I see Cal going down. I feel the guilt of running, of leaving him, even though I know there was nothing else I could do. I sold my house. I couldn't stand being that close to the deep woods anymore. I moved to a small town, a place with streetlights and neighbors close by. I sold all my camera equipment. The silence of nature, the thing I once cherished above all else, is now a source of profound terror for me. When it gets too quiet, I have to turn on a television or a radio just to fill the space. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a legend or a ghost story. It was a living, breathing thing of flesh and blood and terrible intelligence. It's still out there, in the deep, dark places of the world that we haven't paved over yet. The maps are wrong. There are blank spaces still, and in those spaces, monsters dwell. I don't tell this story for attention. I tell it as a warning. Trust your instincts. If you are ever deep in the woods and the birds stop singing, if the world goes unnaturally silent, don't try to explain it away. Don't be brave, just leave. Get in your car and drive away, and don't look back. Because you are being watched by something that has been there long before you, and will be there long after you're gone. And you are trespassing in a place that does not belong to you. I know. I live with that knowledge and the memory of my friends every single day.